Quick hit. Cut through the noise, sharp words, everyday voice, small town talk, big time stakes. Truth in the breaks, truth in the breaks. We are the backbone, holding the line.
Hello and welcome to the second episode of The Backbone Conservative. So this episode is both a continuation of the last episode and possibly an improvement upon it. So the first episode, I was working through the ideas in real time of what it meant to be a backbone conservative, what it was, who I was, how I came to have the opinions that I have, how I'm not a traditional conservative, but I hadn't actually codified or built a real structure of what a backbone conservative is. Well, since then, I have. I've been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of structuring, a lot of building, a lot of putting things together, and I now have a codified system or of ideals, or at least in principle, of what a backbone conservative is. And so this episode is going to be specifically not just what is a backbone conservative, but what is backbone conservatism. So let's just jump straight in. So, simply, what is a backbone conservative? What is backbone conservatism? And backbone conservatism is a system-focused approach to governance that judges success by outcome, not ideology. It's not inherently left or right. It's not based on intention, but it's based on outcome. And it's not narrative driven. It's based entirely upon what actually works in practice, not what works in theory or what sounds good. And because it's not trapped within an ideology, it has a bit more freedom. And it's very much more consistent with looking at a system-wide approach as opposed to individual policies, which much of politics is right now. So I suppose the first question is, well, why is it backbone conservatism? Why have you got conservatism in the name? What makes you a conservative? And it's a fair question, but then the answer is pretty simple. So I believe, and through studying a hell of a lot of international politics, history, governance systems, my personal opinion of what builds strong societies are individual responsibility, personal liberty, limited but effective government, and that's pretty important, and strong institutions. Those are some of the underlying principles that build strong societies where people have the opportunities to build the best lives for themselves. And what do all of those key principles have in common? Well, they are fundamental founding values of conservatism, of the Conservative Party, or at least the traditional Conservative Party. But there's a difference. So traditional conservatives, and probably most people within the Conservative Party, the way that they see it is they have these core ideals, these values, and then they try to build the best society they can based on those values. Whereas I come at it from the other end. I start with what outcomes are going to have the most positive effect on building the best kind of society. There's the best positive net gains for everyone in general. And it just so happens that the methods through which I believe that can be achieved are foundational conservative policies, or not policies, but their ideals, their values, their traditions to an extent. But I'm not constrained by them. I'm not locked in by strict ideological dogma. There is wiggle room. The whole concept is to pick the best thing for the job. And if some aspect of conservative ideology can be proven to have a demonstrable negative impact on what you're trying to do, you get rid of it. You don't stick with it just because it's what we've always done or it's what you're being told to do. That's not your purpose. Your purpose is to create the best outcomes for the people of your nation. And that's the difference between backbone conservatism and traditional conservatism. Yes, we hold the same values at our core. But we do so because we believe they are the most effective, not because they are our core values. Our core values are whatever works. But in general, at least by the measurements that we believe that good governance works, those traditional conservative values are what make it work. Or at least they can be when applied in the most effective manner possible. So it's all well and good saying that we want a better society, we want a more productive society that's better for all the individuals within it. But what is that? How do you measure that? How do you actually say, well, this is a better aspect of society, this is a poorer aspect of society, this is beneficial for society, but this over here is negative for society? And that's a really hard concept, but it's a concept that I've been giving a lot of thought to, and I have come up with a foundational structure of how you would measure it. And it's a measurement that I call productive governance. And productive governance means improving 5 core outcomes within society. So 5 specific issues that by improving all of them, you improve the general well-being of all of society. And those 5 core outcomes are opportunity, stability, fairness, liberty, and long-term societal success. Now, let's go into what each of those actually means. So the first one is opportunity. And this is the ability for people to improve their lives through effort and access systems. So in real world terms, that could be increasing the job market, increasing wages, better access to cheaper housing, or it could be as simple as better access to more green spaces. It could be better access to improved public transport networks. It is anything that gives people the ability to improve their lives, that helps them attain their aspirations. And that could be a broad range of things, and on a case-by-case basis, whatever that is going to change. But that is the first of the core outcomes, that anything that a government should do should first focus on. So the next one is stability. And stability is the ability to rely on systems and plan for the future. So it's all well and good having lots of opportunity here, there, and everywhere, but if that opportunity isn't consistent, it isn't delivered in a sustainable and constant way, how are you supposed to build your life around it? You need the stability there. The systems have to work consistently in a way that you can foresee, plan, and then build around, because you build a house on foundations, and if those foundations are jumping all over the place, you're never going to be able to build a strong house. So the next one is fairness. And this is the consistent and impartial application of the rules. So what that means is that within a system, you could have increases in opportunity, you could have increases in stability. But if certain people or certain groups are able to access those opportunities or that stability at a better rate, or because the rules and regulations that govern the opportunity and the stability are so complex that certain people, either with the knowledge to navigate them better, or people, more importantly, people with the wealth to employ people who are better able to navigate those systems, it gives them an advantage. It gives them an advantage which isn't fair. And as such, you want to produce a system that is as fair for everyone, where, all right, everyone is going to get different things out, but the core concept is that if you are actively participating and working towards that, you are building yourself a better life, that you should have just as much chance as someone else. And that's where fairness comes in. It's more about system behavior as opposed to the direct outcomes. Okay, so the next one is liberty. And this is a really important one. And of the 5, this would probably be weighted more heavily than the others. If you're constantly reducing your system of governance to tangible outcomes, then you run the risk of reducing people to numbers, of making people just cogs in the machine. And sure, doing that can lead to a far more efficient system, but it will almost inevitably result in the trampling of people's liberties, of their freedoms. And that is one thing which, as a conservative, and frankly, as just a decent human being, I think cannot be tolerated. You could build a system that is incredibly efficient, but if that efficiency results in the loss of personal liberties, of personal freedoms, then really what good is that system? Like, you're trying to improve the lives of your people, but if you're unable to live the way that you want, choose the things that you want, then what's the point? So I suppose the core principle would be the protection of individual freedoms, as long as those individual freedoms do not tangibly harm others, and that's also a pretty important separation. So mainly that what that comes down to is causing tangible harm to others is not acceptable, but offending people, so living your life in a way that others might object to, that doesn't cause tangible harm. In the same way that someone who's ultra-conservative might be offended that someone of a, so I would say, different alternative lifestyle lives their lives, might cause great offence. But then the person with that lifestyle is also greatly offended by the way that that more traditional or conservative person views them. Offence is subjective, and you cannot legislate based on something that is subjective, because there's no way of applying it with fairness. And there we go, back to fairness. So yeah, liberty is essential, but you protect people's abilities to live their lives in whatever way that they see fit, but only so long as the way that they see fit doesn't cause direct harm to others. And then the final of the 5 points is long-term societal success. And this is the ability of the system to sustain and improve itself over time. Now, let's see, that's got two sections. The first one is the ability of the system to sustain itself. So you could build a perfect system that gives great levels of opportunity, of stability, of fairness and liberty, and it's fantastic. But if it only does that for the current generation, and the next generation of people come along and suddenly there's nothing left for them, well, the whole foundation upon which the society is built, which is the constant renewal of people going into that society and achieving what they can and building a better society, it undermines that. And frankly, that's something that we are starting to see at present, with younger generations finding it much harder to find the same opportunities that older generations had. And it's having a very detrimental effect to the country. Just look at how younger people are flocking to the political extremes of far left and far right. And you've got the older people who are more centrist saying, well, I can't believe, why are they doing this? It makes no sense. If you've got nothing to protect, then you've got nothing to lose by risking it on something more risky. And frankly, you've got everything to gain. So if you don't build a system that purposefully is sustainable, that allows the same opportunities that people achieved in one generation to be achieved by the people of the next generation, you're not going to have a system that works in perpetuity. And then the second aspect of that long-term success is that one where the system improves itself over time. And this is something that modern politics is desperately lacking, and it's something that I personally can't see why you wouldn't integrate into the system itself. Current politics acts as if, even if it comes up with the most perfect piece of legislation, which I know never really happens, but imagine it did. Imagine you've got a phenomenal piece of legislation that ticks every box, that even though every piece of legislation has trade-offs, it has positives, it has negatives, imagine this one doesn't. Well, it only doesn't have negatives, it's only so perfect for the time that it was created. That only works on the principle that the world is static, that systems don't change, that the world doesn't change, that people don't change, which everybody knows that they do. So unless you build in the capacity for the system to self-regulate itself, to improve itself, to identify negative factors that may not have been negative when they were introduced, but are certainly negative now, you cannot have a system that is truly adaptive over time. You will have one that you could have a new government come in, build the best system they want, but after 10 years or so, all of the wheels are falling off and they're sat there going, well, why? We're just doing exactly what we did before. Well, yeah, that's the problem. The world within which you are operating is not the same as it was before. So doing the same thing is not going to get the same results. So you have to build in the capacity to improve yourself over time. So beyond this, beyond those 5 points, beyond opportunity, stability, fairness, liberty, and long-term societal success, there are 2 lenses, let's call them, through which you have to judge the effectiveness of productive governance, but of those 5 points. That even though you could design every piece of legislation to optimize those 5 areas, there are 2 lenses through which you have to view all those decisions, which, if not correctly viewed, could lead to distortion or, worst case, disaster. And those 2 lenses are, the first one is distributional impact. Now, what that means is how the benefits and costs of a policy are spread across different groups. So you could build a system, you could put loads of new legislation through that increases all 5 areas of productive governance. But if it consistently does that at the expense of one particular group, then the result over time is going to be marginalization and persecution of that group. Because any politician that says there aren't trade-offs in any decision is either massively naive or just lying. We all know there are, and politicians failing to address the fact that there are always going to be positives and negatives of any piece of legislation or regulation, it's just wrong. We all know this, and pretending that it's not happening is inherently wrong. But the trick is to ensure that the negative aspect, well, firstly, that the positives always outweigh the negatives, and backbone conservatism looks at it as system effect. So you could have something that is brilliant at the short scale when it's one cog in a machine, and that cog is brilliant and it does a wonderful job, but what impact is it having on the machine as a whole? Is the addition of that one cog, although it's brilliant improving the job that it does, is it having a net negative effect? Is it slowing the whole machine down just a little bit, but because it slows the whole thing down, doesn't matter how fast it spins, the net impact is negative. But also, because of the distributional impact, is the impact that it's having, the negative effect that it's having, impacting one group within society more than another? Because if you cannot consistently do that and still live in a free and fair society, it goes against people's liberties, which, as we've said, is a core foundational principle of backbone conservatism. So you always have to check, yes, there are going to be negative impacts from any piece of legislation, but are they consistently hitting the same people, or are they consistently giving advantage to the same people? And if so, you have to combat that because you need fairness, as we've discussed. So the second of the 2 lenses is public defensibility. And public defensibility means that decisions must be clearly explained, clearly justified, and be able to be clearly defended within the public. So again, what that means is one of the biggest problems that our society faces is overcomplexity in many of our systems. How many people can actually read legislative documentation and actually understand what it means? All right, we have, I believe, 25,000 pages of tax law in this country. How is anybody supposed to truly understand that? And all we do is keep adding more and more legislation onto these that is equally as complex. So one of the key fundamental principles of backbone conservatism is anything that you produce, any piece of legislation or regulation that you produce, you must be able to publicly defend it in a manner that is understandable to the public, not just a panel room full of experts. You have to be able to argue its case before everyday people, the people that it's going to impact. And it's a core principle because at its heart, if you can't explain a new policy or a new bit of legislation or a new regulation clearly, if you can't explain clearly what it does, what its positives are, what its negatives are, then you probably shouldn't be doing it because you don't understand it well enough to show the positives and negatives it has, or it's not doing those positive and negative things to the degree where you can clearly explain them. And it's such a simple rule, but if we applied that to all of our legislative policies moving forward, we would have such clearer and simpler rules that people could just understand and get behind. So yeah, those are the 2 lenses through which you judge the productive governance principle. And a way that we can sort of condense all of that into one short sentence would be that benefits should come from an individual's participation in a well-functioning system, not from that individual's position within that system. And that systems should reward your contribution, not your ability to navigate the system itself. So the next thing to go into would be, what exactly does backbone conservatism stand for? And I know I've already mentioned a few of these in passing, but it's really worth going into. So the first one, as I've said, and is a key conservative value which is absolutely central to backbone conservatism, is individual responsibility, individual agency, the ability of a person to both go out and do the things that they want to do to succeed if they're able to succeed, but also to bear the responsibility of their actions, to live your life, not the life that someone tells you to live, but also that there's an equality of opportunity, yes, but there's not an equality of outcome. It is your responsibility to live your life, but it's the government's responsibility to ensure that the barriers that might impede your success or your ability to achieve your aspirations are as few as possible. So the next main principle is, as I've explained, clarity in government, and then this also feeds into accountability. So like I was just saying, if laws aren't clear, if regulations aren't clear, if you're not sure exactly what you are and are not allowed to do, you're always going to play things safe. And that strangles innovation. It absolutely undercuts people's ability to try new things, to take manageable risks, to work within the system because they don't actually know how the system works. But as I said, it then gives an advantage to those who do know how the system works, or those who are able to employ those who know how the system works. And a great example of that is with tax regulation and corporations. So big corporations have a whole host of corporate lawyers permanently on staff, and their sole job of these very intelligent, very capable people is to find ways for that company to avoid paying more money by working within the current taxation system. Now, your average worker or small business owner absolutely does not have access to those kind of people. I mean, at best you hire an accountant, but how can one accountant be able to dedicate such time to a single customer that they know how to navigate the 25,000 pages of taxation regulation in this country to find all the loopholes? And even then, the individual has to pay that accountant. If you're a low-income household, or if you're like self-employed and not earning that much and you're trying to do all your taxes yourself, you're never going to know what to do. It's giving a massively unfair advantage to those who can access it. And the only reason for that advantage is because they've got the knowledge to gain access to that complexity. There's no legitimate reason for it. There's no reason why a person without access to that complexity shouldn't have access to that complexity, other than the fact that they can't afford to pay it. And so that is a really simple example of how clarity in governments and legislation and regulation could lead to really positive impacts on people's ability to live their lives and innovate and grow businesses, or just live better, fairer lives. They don't even have to take advantage of all of the systems. They just have to know what they can and can't do. So, I mean, I've already explained the concept of productive governance, those 5 concepts of opportunity, stability, fairness, liberty, and long-term societal gain. But that basically runs through everything. That is the metric by which you should measure every government action, every piece of legislation, every new regulation. Everything that the government does should be measured against increasing those 5 things at a system-wide level, not just the small scale, but at the big scale, because doing that is how you build a better country. So that is one of the core principles. So next core principle, as I've stated, protecting individual rights. So this goes hand in hand with working into productive governance, but protecting the individual is the first step in allowing the individual to succeed. Giving them the freedom to do what they want allows them to do what they want. And some people just want to skate through life, and that's absolutely fine. They just want to just get by. That's good for them. That's their right. But a lot of people have aspirations. They want to succeed. But if they don't have the rights and the legal protections to succeed, then that success is never going to happen. So next key principle is transparency. And this is a pretty big one, both in stopping corruption, from stopping bad actors from taking advantage of things, but also from returning trust in governance. So transparency goes beyond just not doing things behind closed doors or hiding things. It means presenting things in a way that everyone can understand. And again, I'm linking back to this clearness and accountability, that if a government systems are transparent, if they're open to the public, then you have faith in the system because it allows people to go in and look at the things. So one, you've built a clearer, more concise system so people understand the rules. And then two, you've made the outcomes and the things going into those rules and the things coming out of those rules more transparent. So your average person can look at something and go, yep, that works. Or they can look at it and go, I don't understand, that doesn't work. And you hold politicians accountable. You make better decisions because they have to provide all the information behind those decisions and the impact that those decisions are going to have, both the positive and the negative, to the public. There's no hiding behind things. We all live in the real world, so we all have to know how to live in the world. Hiding things doesn't help anyone other than the people at the top. And yes, and the final core principle of backbone conservatism is, as I've explained, the adaptability aspect of having a governmental system which has the humility to admit that it isn't always going to get things right, and the common sense to know that things aren't always going to be the same. You have to build adaptability into the system itself. Because currently what we have, you have a piece of legislation goes out and it could be incredibly well crafted, but eventually it's not going to keep doing its job as well. And we only change things when they become so poor at their job that there is enough public outcry or clear evidence, overwhelming evidence, that they need to be removed. And that just means you're waiting for problems to get as bad as they possibly can before doing anything about it. You're being reactive and not proactive, and that is never positive for anything. So by implementing adaptation, by building it into the core of everything that you do, you make adaptability a core concept. You ensure that the systems are going to be constantly working, constantly improving, and everybody is going to have, on the whole, better governance, because the government is constantly holding itself to account and trying to do a better job. So, okay, the next thing is, well, what makes backbone conservatism different than all the political movements that are currently out there? Well, firstly, this isn't an ideology. You have to be incredibly clear about that. If anything, it's an anti-ideology, because the ideology is make the best decisions, get the best outcomes, and the best outcomes at the system level for the most number of people with that good evenly distributed across society. Whereas politics at the moment, it's almost always, it's narrative driven, it's short term, it's reactive. Whereas backbone conservatism is system focused, looking at the full scale of things. It is outcome driven and is long term driven. And a lot of people say, oh, well, when you look at things like that, they're hard to explain and people never get behind them. They want to see the short-term things. They want to see the reactive things. But if you've got clear, concise systems, if you've got simple legislations that are effective, but you've just cut them down to the bare bones, the most important principles that can be easily explained, easily defended, then you can show how, yes, something that's got a better long-term benefit but a worse short-term benefit is preferable, because it's easy to explain. And the public aren't stupid. If you can show them, look, all right, this is option A, it's going to be really good for 3 years, but then it's going to get bad. Option B, not so good for the first 5 years, but after 10 years and in the long term moving forward is going to be much, much better for everyone. If you can explain that in a way that is clear and can be publicly defended, then most people are going to go with the long term option. Because despite what certain people think, I believe that most people want the best for other people. They want the best for society. They want the best for their country. They just need to have their options presented to them in a way that they can understand. So the next thing could be that you're sat there listening and thinking, he's starting to sound a bit like a populist. I'm hearing a bit of a reform twang here. And I'm going to come out the gate saying straight away, not only is that not the case, backbone conservatism at its core is very, very much anti-populist. And let me explain that. So populism is also saying that systems aren't working well, but the populist argument is to just tear everything down and start again. That they think that the reason things aren't working is someone's specific fault. It's this person's fault. It's this group of people's fault. It's their fault because they weren't there before and things were working. They're there now and things aren't working, so it's their fault. And they are certain in their beliefs. They can't ever be wrong because, of course, they're not wrong. What they're saying is common sense. It's simple. Yeah, they're always right. They've got to be, because how else could things be? They're saying the things we're all thinking. And backbone conservatism goes directly against this because of our belief in personal accountability and responsibility. If something goes wrong, we look at the actual reasons, and a lot of the time, especially in politics, the reasons are because politicians made poor decisions. And so you don't point fingers, because by shifting blame, you reduce your ability to learn from your mistakes. And the purpose of government isn't to look shiny and perfect, it's to govern in the most effective manner possible. And if you're refusing to accept that you ever make mistakes, how are you ever going to adapt and make better decisions in the future? That level of responsibility is essential to adapt to leading a country well, to allowing everyone to succeed by putting in place rules which improve over time. And if you're always right and never wrong, and the reason why something went wrong was someone else's fault, well, then if you're always perfect, then you're never going to try and better yourself. And if you never try and better yourself, that's fine if you're an individual, but if you're leading a country, it is your duty to constantly better yourself, to constantly be self-critical, to constantly look into what you've done, see what worked, what didn't, explain the trade-offs, and do a better job in the future. The trade-offs must be explicit, they must be evaluated, and they must be publicly explained. Because if you can explain them in clear and concise terms to the public, all right, some people are going to be angry, but at least they understand how you got where you are. It builds public trust. It doesn't just produce scapegoats, which in reality never lead to any positivity at all. So yeah, that's the difference with populism. So then you can say, oh, okay, so you just being technocrats, like all the politicians we currently have, that they believe that we live in incredibly complex systems, and so the only way to properly navigate them and get the best outcomes is to create incredibly complex laws, because the world is a complex place. And this results in laws that people don't understand, a system that is dominated by experts, and these are experts who often are so disconnected to the realities of real life that their actual expertise doesn't bear that much positive outcomes on the very systems they're trying to improve, because they don't know how you say it's where the rubber meets the road. They don't know how the actual implementation of their decisions differs in the real world situation than it does from within their test areas. And that is why we have a huge amount of problems these days. And so backbone conservatism actively opposes that at its core, because we try to reduce complexity. And now this isn't just simplification for simplification's sake. We're not reducing standards. We are taking the overly complex systems we currently have and trying to, where it's applicable, reduce that complexity to find a balance between complexity and output. You could constantly make things, tweak them, make them better. But if the product you're left with at the end is so delicate that it can't withstand any sort of disruption, well, that's part of the problem. You need to be robust, you need to be adaptable. The real world changes, and so we need laws that can change as well. So there's the really famous problem-solving principle, Occam's razor, which is when you have two competing hypotheses to explain one phenomenon, the simplest explanation that requires the fewest assumptions is usually the best. And this works. I mean, this works across the board, that if you can get to a solution through more simple means, it is going to be more robust, more fair, and in this case, easier to explain. And as I've already gone through, making things easier to explain is essential for having better governance. And so this isn't to say that we believe that you should simplify everything. No, backbone conservatism is driven by productive outcomes. So if you can prove that having additional complexity increases the productive governance values of a piece of legislation or regulation, by all means, have the complexity. Increase the complexity if you can improve that increased complexity makes a better positive outcome. But the fact is, we've gotten to such a point in this nation, in our legislative and regulatory systems, of constantly adding more and more complexity. But like I said, we're out of balance. So backbone conservatism just tries to return balance in the most effective way possible. So now you can sit there and think, right, all of this sounds very good, but how does it actually work in principle? Like, these are good ideas, but you haven't explained how you would make any of this work in real life. Well, I have delved into this some. So the concept I'm going to outline is, how do you make better legislation and regulation? You can't just say, oh, we're going to make it better. How do you implement this? How do you make these decisions better? And the way that I do this is through what I call decision boards. And these are boards, groups of people who make the decisions. And they're designed to not be controlled by a single political party, to reduce partisan decision making. So you're not making decisions based on a particular party ideology. You're doing it on what's going to have the best outcome, and then the best outcome for the system as a whole, not just the individual aspects that you are looking at. So if you're making a new regulation regarding housing development, you're not just looking at how that's going to improve housing development. You're going to look at how that regulation is then going to ripple out through society and how it's going to affect society as a whole, because it might have a really beneficial impact for that one narrow area of housing development, but the impact of it, if it then slows your ability to make new housing, which is something we desperately have in the UK, then the net impact is going to be negative. So you always have to keep that system-wide focus. And the aim is to design better bits of legislation and make better decisions, not win arguments. So, okay, how do we establish who sits on these boards? Who are these people that are going to craft new bits of regulation and legislation which are so much better than the systems that we have at present? So there are going to be 3 groups of people who sit on these boards. So the first are subject matter experts, so people who actually know a lot about the system, about the area where the regulation or legislation is going to directly impact. And not just, as I said, at the specific level, they need to be experts at the wider system, at how those effects are going to ripple out. So you might have people who are not necessarily top in their field on that specific issue, but what they are top in their field at, or is what they have a hell of a lot of experience is how decisions like the ones you're about to make are going to impact society in a wider sense, because they have to be there. Those are the people you need making decisions. But another point is that every one of those subject matter experts has to be impartial. They have to show that they will have no vested interest in one outcome either way of the way a bit of legislation or regulation is expressed. So an example that I can think of with that is, I'm an ecologist, and we are constantly seeing more and more ecological legislation brought in, which sounds great. But then one of the reasons for that is that if you have ecologists or people of high environmental morality and standing making the decisions, then they're always going to say we need more environmental law. They're going in there thinking, yes, that's exactly what we need, because either that's the way that my morality has shifted me, or whether they know it or not, more environmental legislation means more work for ecologists, means more money. So you always, this is something that I feel that happens, especially with the insane amount of environmental legislation and regulation we have in this country. And I'm an ecologist saying that. This is something we need to avoid. You have to make sure the people making the decisions do not have a vested interest, whether it be financial, whether it be moral, ideological, whatever. They cannot have a vested interest in the outcome of the decisions they are making. So the next group of people that would sit on these decision boards are MPs themselves. So they would have to come from multiple parties, not just to ensure that there is a balance and that ideology doesn't take too much of a stance, because that's something we actively don't want, but also so that multiple parties have ownership over a piece of legislation. They've taken part in making it. They've had a say, and that massively reduces the partisan effect of people voting against bits of legislation just because it was put across by another political party, regardless of what impact it has. Another political party put this forward, and so we are going to disagree with it. And again, that's something that we saw here in the UK with when Labour came in and they tried to push through their welfare reforms, and there were massive amounts of rebellions within the Labour camp. Well, that shouldn't have mattered, because we all know that this country desperately needs welfare reform, and in particular the Conservative Party knows that we need it. So it shouldn't have mattered that large numbers of Labour MPs rebelled, because the Conservative Party should have backed the government. Because, all right, they didn't go as far as we'd like, but at least they were happening. At least there was some reform was better than no reform. But that didn't happen, because the Conservative Party was more interested in making the government look bad than they were in making a productive outcome for the nation. And that angered me so much. And that is something that goes directly against the core values of backbone conservatism. You do what is right for the nation. And if you can explain your arguments clearly, no one should be able to argue against you unless something that you've done inherently goes against some core part of their ideology, or if they're showing that they're putting their party first. And then the third group of people that we are putting onto these boards. Now, this is a new concept, and this is something that I believe in thoroughly because I've lived it. I've studied environmental law at university. I've been an academic with environmental research for my doctorate, but then for the last 6 years, I've been a practitioner. I'm an ecological consultant. I've been seeing where all those laws and all those regulations, all those ideas that inform them actually take effect, and seeing how monumentally inefficient they are was one of the driving forces for me getting into politics and starting backbone conservatism. Because if you don't have people who actually understand how regulations are implemented, part of the regulation design, then they're always going to be wildly inefficient. So that's the third group of people, real world practitioners. So again, if you're going to put in a new piece of legislation that deals with hospital waiting lists or medical matters, you shouldn't just have the top guys, like your top doctors from across the country and your top people, your admin people who are running the hospitals. You also should have your nurses there. They're the ones who see the real impact of these decisions every day, and almost 99 times out of 100, if you went to people on the ground and asked them, all right, give me 3 things that simple improvements that if you make would have a massive impact across your entire sector, they could give you them. And they'd be easy, they'd be simple, and they're things they see every day that annoy them every day, that get in the way of them doing the best job that they can. And that's why you have to have real-world practitioners as part of the design process for new pieces of legislation and regulation. And that is something that we simply do not have at the moment. I don't know whether it's an elitism thing or it's a technocratic thing, but we don't have it, and we lose so much expertise because of that. And so what having these 3 groups of people, your subject matter experts, your MPs and your real world practitioners, does is it brings expertise, democratic input and real world understanding into any new piece of legislation or regulation that you produce. So the next thing is, okay, so you've got your people who sit on your board. How do they make their decisions? And their role is to evaluate the evidence and design the policies to improve the outcome at the system level. So they just get as much information as they can. They get experts in, as much data in, more practical experience from people on the ground. You bring in info from every possible aspect of an area, so you can get the broadest understanding of how it will impact not just the single area where it's designed for, but the system as a whole. How you can get the most productive governance out of any piece of legislation. You need as much info as possible, and that information needs to come from all levels of society. Because, again, as someone who's been an expert and then an on-the-ground practitioner, there are so many things that experts just don't know or don't consider to be important, which in reality are monumentally important, and they just don't think about them. So the final aspect is once all the decisions have been made, once you've gathered all this amazing information, you've produced something that's been looked at by people across all aspects of society, how do you actually give it the go-ahead? And this is where you bring the democratic check in. So the expertise informs the decision, but democratic institutions retain final authority. And what that means is it goes to Parliament, it's debated and it's voted on. So the boards design, but Parliament decides. And what that means is that if you've produced something that is, so your regulation and legislation needs to be clear, concise, be able to be explained and publicly defended. Well, that means once you put it to Parliament, you can explain it. You can make the point. You can show that here are the positives, here are the negatives, and anybody who, if like, it wouldn't have gone forward if the positives didn't massively outweigh the negatives. So anybody on opposing political parties who votes against it is either showing their true colours at putting the party and party loyalties above the welfare of the country, or they found a genuinely credible reason to criticise it. And if that is a truly good reason that you hadn't anticipated, well, you should go back and look at the legislation again. It's all about producing the most effective pieces of legislation. Because the problem that we have at the moment isn't just that we have bad policies, we have broken systems. And backbone conservatism is about fixing the system itself and getting measurable results. That is always, always the aim. Better results, because that's how you build a better society. So that's a really brief overview of the key features of backbone conservatism. But I always want to end every episode with what I call a radical idea. And considering the little rant that I went on, you might be able to guess what my radical idea is going to be for this episode. But it's pretty simple. And it's this, that every law that is passed should come with a plain English policy explanation. That's it, that anybody can understand. It doesn't matter how complex the issues are, though I personally feel that reducing complexity makes for better legislation. But regardless of that, this is something that the government could do today. Any law that they pass also comes with a couple of sheets that explain the law in plain English. And what that means is that it will explain what the law does, what it seeks to do, why it exists, who it's going to affect, what the positives are, and here's the important bit, what the negatives are and what the risks are, and then how those positives and negatives are going to be measured over time to see how effective the law is. And it's such a simple concept, but firstly, it builds trust in our legislative system, which is monumentally lacking at present, because most of the time we don't have a clue what politicians are on about. It shows that they've done their work, and yes, there are going to be negative aspects. Every political decision has trade-offs, and pretending that they don't is wrong. So you show the public, here are the trade-offs, here are the positives, here are the negatives, and this is how we're going to measure them. And if a piece of legislation can't defend itself based on that plain English explanation, then it shouldn't go forward, because if you can't explain something clearly and you can't measure it, it isn't good governance. So yeah, very simple radical idea for this episode, but it's one that I think would make huge amounts of positive gains in our political system. So that is the end of episode 2. I know I've gone on quite a bit, but I thought it was a fairly broad explanation of the concepts that I've been coming up with backbone conservatism. And if you are interested in more, the website, it has a lot more information than what I've just rattled on about here, but we've gone into some real deep detail, because this isn't about making a new ideology, because it's not an ideology. It's not about pushing a political narrative. The whole point of backbone conservatism is getting better outcomes, system-based governance that achieves the best outcomes for the most people and does so proportionally to everyone equally, or as equal as you can be in the real world. It's about building governance that actually works and that improves over time. So thank you very much for listening, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Luck and health to you.
Everyday voice, small town talk, big time stakes. Truth in the breaks. Truth in the breaks. We are the backbone, holding the line. Plain speech, clear eyes, drawing the show begin.